Good evening and welcome to the Fantasy Formula One podcast. I'm your host, Paul, and today we get to kick off the actual driver bio segments, which I'm super excited for. It's one of the reasons I really want to do this podcast was to sit and analyze all the drivers as it pertains to the Fantasy Formula One game. If you're looking, it's not going to be up to the minute news. This isn't like me reporting on what they've done and what the hot buzz is or anything like that. This is just talking about what they did last season, where they're at now, and hopefully what kind of points I can predict or we can predict that they're going to be able to put up in the 2024 season. We're going to kick this off with Daniel Ricciardo, and he is personally one of my favorite drivers in F1. He's been around for a while, raced in Red Bull, raced with McLaren, among others. Let me see, I'm pulling up his bio right here. Right now he races for AlphaTauri, which we'll get into that in a second. But he has 32 podiums, 239 Grand Prix entries, and so like he's a good driver. He, like I said, he bounced around the teams for a while. As far as I know, he always was trying to find that slot where he could be the number one driver, but he was always the second driver. And then after he raced with McLaren in 2023. He lost his in 2022. Excuse me. He lost his ride, and then Red Bull brought him on as their third driver for 2023, and he just seemed to have a blast with it. And then starting around round 12 for Hungary, AlphaTauri got rid of their driver Nick De Vries, which is a whole stuff about that. We're not going to get into it now. And since AlphaTauri is kind of like a mini Red Bull team, like they're owned by I think they're owned by Red Bull. Like don't quote me on that, but they're definitely chummy. And so Red Bull gave Daniel Ricciardo to AlphaTauri, and he drove for, I think it was 7 races. And so we're going to go ahead and go over, and again, then he got injured and whatever, which we'll talk about all that in a second. But we're going to go race by race, talk about how he did, and see what the statistics I've ran can hopefully predict or indicate about his performance for next year. And we'll talk about his points and his PPM and all that. So he was out of the cockpit until round 12. And then he came in, and in FP1 he did 14, FP2 he placed 14th, and FP3 he placed 18th. Now, so I'm on the fence about how all this works, but like my opinions, I should say, about how all this works. It doesn't matter whether you get first or you get 20th in practice, in free practice or final practice, whatever they call it. It doesn't matter. You can be the slowest car on the track during practice and win, and that is good. No one cares how bad or how slow you are. The coverage of it, going to the races and watching the practice, like they rank it on the scoreboard, and it gives the talking heads, myself included, something to talk about. But it really you can't gauge how well they're going to do in the race necessarily based off of practice. So what I've tried to do is I've run the stats on it and tried to see which drivers you can indicate. It doesn't mean that you always can, but I'm trying to correlate performance in the final practices with the race and see which drivers that correlates to. Because some drivers just don't care. Other drivers, like Max Verstappen, they can be all over the map. Usually they're going to do fine just because they're not going to not do fine. But like Ferrari, for example, they'll do great in practices, great in qualifying in the 2023 season, and then they couldn't pull it off for the race. So when we're talking about all this, it doesn't necessarily mean, like I fully acknowledge that just because you get 14th in practice doesn't mean anything, right? So anyway, so he did 14, 14, and 18, and the reason why we care about the practices is because that is the last chance we have to watch the drivers perform before we lock our teams at the start of qualifying, and then we're stuck with them for the rest of the race weekend. So it's in our best interest as Fantasy Formula One players to figure out what we can derive from how we can predict race performance based on practice. And a lot of them you can't, some of them you can, and that's what we're here. That's one of the things we're going to be talking about. So again, so he's fresh in the cockpit. He placed 13th, which is surprisingly good for somebody who, I mean, it's not surprisingly good for Ricciardo. Like I feared he would do well, but for somebody who's been out of the cockpit that long, that's good. And then, so that's round 12 and round 13. It was a sprint weekend. He had placed 9th in his first practice, and then he placed 16th overall in the race after qualifying 19th, which again, this is very important. Your drivers want to, and I'm working on another podcast that just talks about points because I've run some more stats recently and it's really interesting. Your drivers, you want to make sure that they place better than they qualify, because as soon as they, for every position under or over that what they qualify, that's a point. So as soon as you have somebody who always qualifies 10th but always finishes 15th, well, they're getting negative 5 points every race, where if they had qualified 15th and finished 15th, it would be a 0. So again, this is one of those reasons, this is one of those times when what we as fantasy players want tends to diverge from what the race team wants, because the race team always wants to do as good as they can. We want them to finish well, but it's in our best interest for them to start low, finish high, rather than start high, finish anywhere other than high. But again, we're getting away from Daniel. So Daniel finishes 16th. There is a sprint that weekend, qualifies at 11, finishes 10. Again, that's a positive trend. That's exactly what we're looking for. Then come the Netherlands, and RIP, that is when Daniel Ricciardo hits the wall and breaks his hand. So they bring in Liam Lawson, who we're going to have our own podcast on him. He does really well for the 15, for round 15 in Italy, for round 16 in Singapore. Liam Lawson's still in the seat. Round 17 Japan, Liam Lawson's still in the seat. Round 18 Qatar, Liam Lawson's still in the seat. And then in the Texas Grand Prix, round 19, Daniel Ricciardo comes back in. He's not pushing it quite as much. Actually, I can't say that. He's still finishing for FP1. He placed 14th. In the race, he placed 15th. So again, a rock solid middle of the back of the pack, which is right where if you have an AlphaTauri, that's wonderful performance for AlphaTauri. If Nick DeVries was performing that way, he wouldn't have lost his seat. But so then, and there was the sprint that weekend as well. He qualified 11th, placed 12th. Kind of a bummer, not quite what we're looking for from him, but as far as fantasy points goes, but it's not bad, and I don't have the stats on how many he passed or anything like that. Then round 20 in Mexico, for FP1, he did finish 8th, then 6th, then 9th in FP3, which is good. Qualified 4th, finished 7th. And so when it comes to fantasy, I don't have, let me see if I have that. I don't have those stats in front of me. So you'll lose, he would have lost 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. He would have lost 3 points because he qualified 4th, finished 7th. However, he also would have gotten some pretty good points for qualifying 4th, and he would still been in the points for finishing 7th. And again, it depends on how many times he was passed or whatnot. So that you get -1 or +1 for every position you finish, but also every time you pass somebody on the track on merit. It doesn't count if they're going into the pits. It doesn't count if they're in the pits. But and it doesn't count if they crash out. But if you pass somebody on the track in merit, then you get a positive point. So if Daniel Ricciardo had started out 4th when he had gone into the pits, if he'd come out and then been able to pass some slower cars, he could have gotten more points. And actually, let me see how many fantasy points he had for that. Where was that? It's somewhere here. Fantasy points for Daniel Ricciardo. So he had 12 fantasy points that weekend, which, again, isn't bad, especially for somebody who is a replacement, in quotes, a replacement driver. You just have Red Bull has a really great replacement driver, so that's Daniel Ricciardo. Moving on to round 21, Brazil. He finished 14th in FP1. And then qualified 17th, finished 13th. So, again, Daniel Ricciardo, you're normally, except for that one when he finished a place or 2 back, he'll qualify well. And he'll qualify halfway decently. He'll finish well, which is great. And again, for that sprint race, he qualified 8th, finished 9th. So they're still right neck and neck. So 1 place, 2 places, I'm fine with. The important thing to know about Daniel Ricciardo is, I'll summarize in a minute. Las Vegas, He, let me see here. FP1 was 13th and 19th and 20th. Las Vegas was kind of a weird race. He qualified 15th, finished 14th. You know, a little uncharacteristic, but there's a lot of people that had issues. Las Vegas, Lando Norris crashed out because he hit a manhole cover or wherever that pipe was sticking out. So I'm not going to hang up too much on Las Vegas. But then we go to Abu Dhabi, where he's ridden before and everyone's driven before. The ultimate race of the season. 12th, 18th in the practices, qualified 15th, and finished 11th. So as a trend with Daniel Ricciardo, he finishes at least as good as he does qualifying. So he doesn't normally lose a lot of positions from qualifying. But the important thing for us, again, is what can we predict from his practice results. And with Daniel Ricciardo, I have the stats right here. Where did it go? And with Daniel Ricciardo, over the whole course of the season, he finishes, he races. So if you take the race results compared to FP1 results, his race results are 5 positions worse overall over all 22 races. All 7 races for him. Sorry. So he only raced 7 races. His FP1 results, his race results are 5 positions worse than his FP1. His race, he finishes the race 6 positions better than he does in FP2, and he finishes the race 20 positions better than he does in FP3 over the course of the whole season. And over the course of the season, he finished 9 positions better than he qualified. So what is all the points to this? Based on looking at his practices versus how well he performs, we can anticipate him doing better in the race than he does throughout the practices. And why is that important? Well, it means that when you're watching the race, watching the practices, I should say, if you're like me and you watch the practices, don't freak out when he does bad in practice, or if he is only in 13, 14, 15. It doesn't look like he tries that hard to hurry up and beat the clock and hurry up and beat everybody. He's on his own program, and then he finishes where he finishes in practice, but he always does better, most of the time, does better in practice, in the race than he does in practice. So now we're going to go and look at the year-end results that I ran, all right? So Daniel Ricciardo completed, and these are results, some of which I calculated, some of which I pulled straight from the F1 website. Whatever the F1 website didn't provide me, I went ahead and ran the numbers on myself. So I'll just kind of go through the list and let you know. Rounds completed. He ran 7 races, 7 rounds. Most everybody else got 22. He got 7. He overtook 31 times. For points, he overtook 31 times. That's 31 points he got over those 7 races just for overtaking people. The average overtakes per race was 4.43. So about 4.5, he would pass between 4 and 5 drivers every race. He didn't get any podiums. That's fine. He only finished in the top 10 once, but it was only 7 races. Again, he's a replacement driver. And he finished in the top 10 14% of his races, which is pretty good. As soon as you extrapolate that out for the whole season, if 1 out of every 7 he gets in the top 10, well, then he'll finish in the top 10  3 or 4 times a year, which is good. He had, and this is a very important statistic for me, he had 0 DNFs. Whenever you get a do not finish or a DNF, you don't finish the race, that driver gives you negative 20 points, which is rough. You can't take too many of those before what happens with Ferrari, and it just really decimates your racing year. So I keep track of those. He did not have any DNFs. Yes, you can make the argument that he crashed in practice, broke his hand, and he was out. But that was a crash in practice. You're not penalized in the Fantasy Formula 1 game. You're not penalized for crashing in practice. You're not penalized for crashing any other time. You get penalized for crashing in qualifying, and you get penalized for crashing or not finishing in the race. But we don't care about the crash in practice, so it's fine. Percent of the races where he received a DNF, 0. He finished, okay, that's the other half of the stat. He finished in the bottom 10 without a DNF 85% of the time. He never got a fastest lap award. He, cool, didn't get the driver of the day, which is fine. The only reason, so the FIA, they have a, not the FIA, yeah, but the FIA, they have a thing where towards the end of every race, you can like log on to their app, and they give you like 3 or 4 drivers that they nominate, and you can say which driver you want to get the driver of the day. And whoever wins the driver of the day gets like another couple points or something in Fantasyland. And I have to look at the rules again to see if they actually get any in the championship. I don't think they do. But as soon as you are somebody like, I'm just looking at the stats here, right above here, Charles Leclerc got driver of the day twice. So he had driver of the day for 10% of his races, which equates to more points in Fantasyland, which we'll get into all that later on. End of the year cost for Daniel Ricciardo was $5.5 million, and that is up because where did that number go? Oh, back there. I thought it was over this way. Let me find where that stat is. Performance. I love my spreadsheet, but it gives me all sorts of cool information, but I can't always find it. I need to organize my spreadsheet. But the punchline is I want to say that he started out at like 4.5 million and he finished at 5.5. He started out at 5 or 4.5. So the thing is his value did go up pretty significantly. Most drivers, you can anticipate their value going up about $500,000 over the course of the year. He went up $500,000, at least, possibly more, in the course of like 7 races. Which again, he is very valued, and I'm about to get to another point why. And their cost is that. End of the year F1 fantasy points, he got 49 in 7 races, which is, again, we're going to go into we talked about in previous podcasts, the points per $1 million, right? The PPM, the great equalizer in this game. The FIA published a points per million for him as of 0.4. And how they got that, they took his total points, 49, divided by the number of races, 22, and then, so points per round was, divided it by the number of, okay, I'm start that part over, just because I derailed myself and then got back onto it. The FIA said his points per million was 0.4, which is very good. That's a very strong points per million. How they derive that, and I've talked about this in other podcasts, how they derive that was they took the total points of the season, divided it by the total races in the season, 22, and then took that number of points that it came out. I don't have the exact math written out in front of me. Then take those total number of points that they got per race and divide that by the divide that by how much money that they cost, right? So you get points, instead of points per race, you get points per million per race. Now, the issue with this 0.4 that the FIA published is that they use the exact same algorithms for all the drivers, which means whether a driver raced 1 race or the driver raced 22 races, they use the same, divided by the number of races. So Daniel Ricciardo didn't race 22 races. He raced 7, which dramatically impacts his points per million. So his points per million are not 0.4. They're 1.27, which puts Daniel Ricciardo as the second most valuable driver in fantasy Formula One at the end of the season. The Sergio Perez had a 1.27 points per million, and he came in second in the championship. The only person with better than a 1.27 points per million was Max Verstappen, who had a 1.45. So, while Daniel Ricciardo, all during the 2023 season, and I missed this until I was running the stats after the season, they were not misrepresenting. The representation of his points per million was not accurate, and so people thought he was just the rookie driver. 0.4, okay, that's fine. That's roughly where everybody else is. Nah, he wasn't getting as many points because with the points per million, the more millions you spend, the more points you get, is a way to look at it. But he was the second best driver points per million in F1 for all of last year, and does not reflect that way on the official website. And he only got 49 points when Sergio Perez got 581. But if you look at it just price per point, he's number 1. So what does this mean going into next year? I anticipate if you can get Daniel Ricciardo, now that he's had time to recover, this dude has all the experience wrapped in deep fried in charisma and capability, right? If you can get Daniel Ricciardo on your team, period, he is worth it. He is absolutely worth it. Very rarely do I ever plan on telling people who to get, especially if because like he drives for AlphaTauri, right? So they can't give him a Ferrari or a Red Bull price tag. But here, just in the 7 races he drove, he proved that he is bringing in points per million. If he's valued at 5.5, he's bringing in as many points per. He's just as good an investment at $5.5 million as Sergio Perez is at $20 million. So, very few drivers will I ever do this. But for Daniel Ricciardo, if you can get him for under $6 million, do it. He will be the best driver you have on your team, points per million in 2024. If they price him this fairly, as soon as they realize their not math mistake, it was not a mistake they made. They just didn't change the algorithm. As soon as they do update their algorithm, and they realize how many points per million this guy was putting up, they're gonna jump him to 10 or 12 million. Price wise, and they should, but I really hope they didn't. They don't, because then no one's going to have him, because AlphaTauri doesn't. I hope they don't trash his points per million just to keep him at that lower tier. I really hope they don't do that. But if Daniel Ricciardo, if you can get him for $6 million or less, then don't even think about it. Just add him to your team. It's the best decision you can make based on the stats I have here. Well, I hope you enjoyed this quick driver bio of Daniel Ricciardo. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Cheers.